talk. So I am delighted to welcome tonight's featured guest, Dr. Stephen P. Kelner. And if you were wondering, what are the things that motivate writers and other creatives? And how can we manage these motives? If you're wondering, what are the 7 deadly myths of creativity and how can we overcome writer's block? Well, Dr. Kelner will be discussing the different mindsets that can either stall or motivate writers and other creatives. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Stephen Kelner, Dr. Stephen Kelner is a motivational psychologist, a writer, and an assessor and developer of leaders. For nearly 30 years, he has been studying the nature of writing and creativity. He not only tapped into the existing psychological research into creativity, he launched his own unique scientific study of numerous professional writers in a range of genres, interviewing and assessing them to derive the core drivers, traits, skills, and practices that enabled their success. His findings were published in the book Motivate Your Writing, now in a substantially updated second ebook edition, which came about from numerous discussions, additional research, and workshops done with hundreds of writers since the first edition came out. He is himself a multiply published writer in nonfiction and fiction. He's president and co-founder of Ascent Leadership Networks, which develops executive leaders in ways that matter in unique and measurable ways. He is married to his favorite editor, award-winning and best-selling mystery and urban fantasy writer, Toni L. Kelner, or Leigh Perry, whom we had the honor of hosting last May. They are parents to 2 highly creative children, an animator, and a musician. So Dr. Stephen Kelner, I would like to welcome you again, and the floor is yours. So take it away anytime you want.
Thanks, folks. It's good to see you all, or those that I can see. It's great to see you. Oh, and there's Sarah Smith. Hey. And what we're going to do is spend a little time. I have some slides because, you know, you have to, but I'm going to try to cut back and forth between that and conversation. So let me just get those up. But if I wanted to, just people wanted to see me first. So I'm Steve Kelner. I'm a motivational psychologist. I'm a writer. And what happened, the reason why I got into this was actually because many years ago, I'm not going to say how many, my wife and I, who were both writers by hobby or by vocation, perhaps, she was trying to finish her first book. And she turned to me at one point and said, I just can't seem to finish. I get about 2 or 3 chapters in, and then it just starts trailing off. And I said, why does this keep happening? To which I said, well, and now I realize that was probably not intended to be answered, but I had an answer, which is, I am a motivational psychologist. Perhaps I could help. And ultimately, I talked to her about a lot of things she could do, some of which I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to tell you about some of the things she did because she was a good example and she's given me permission. And ultimately, she finished her first book, and then her second, and then her third. At this point, she's published 17 novels and some 30 short stories. So, she's done okay. And one of the things that she told me around book 3 or so was, you need to share this. So I said, okay, that makes sense. And me being me, I then spent another 5 years interviewing other writers, including a couple people on this video. And assessing them and trying to find out what's going on here. So that's the source of what we're talking about. And then, as Rula pointed out, after the first book was published, I did a number of workshops and presentations to everyone, to like the romance writers of America, the science fiction writers, conferences, mystery conferences, you name it, and got a lot more input and questions. So the second edition it's about 10% longer than the first book, but I've also rewritten a lot of the stuff in it. So that's how I got to there. So just so you know, and the fact is, I feel your pain in that I too am a writer. I've published 2 mystery short stories, and I don't even know how many nonfiction articles, and as well as the book. So I'm going to speak as a researcher, but also as a practitioner. Okay. So, and if people do have questions, please feel free to fire them up in the chat. I'm not going to guarantee I can answer them right now, but we will come back to them, and we're going to try to keep a significant amount of time for people to to be able to ask questions. So, all right, and now, there we go. That's the cover of the second edition, the ebook. For those who are interested, it's on all the usual locations. So, let me see if I can get more people pictured here. So here's what we're going to talk about. First, a few key principles that I use to approach this work. And then we're going to talk about motivation, which is in essence why people do what they do. And then we're going to talk about how do you manage those motives through the way you set your goals and manage yourself. And then we're going to talk a little more about creativity, because it's kind of, in my view, is you start with the motivation. And that's kind of what my whole focus is. I don't teach how to write plot, character, or, I mean, lots of people can teach you that. But most people are not talking about how do you just sit down and keep writing. And in my view, if you do that, you will practice and you will get better. So motivation first, and then that'll help you develop all the other things. So that's where I'm focusing. But it is worth talking about creativity, because there's actually a fair amount of science around that. And I think there's a lot of myths, which is why we're going to talk about the 7 deadly myths of, where people go wrong in their thinking about creativity, sometimes in ways that get in their way. So, okay, and we'll do Q&A. So, a few key principles. 1, you are creative, right? That's not a question. I've had people say, oh, I'm not really creative. Yes, you are. It's hardwired into the human animal. Part of the issue is that people think of creativity as you have to be Leonardo da Vinci or Shakespeare or somebody. And that's not true. Creativity is connecting things that were not connected before. And human beings are very, very good at that. So if you're tinkering with a recipe, that's creativity. If you put together different articles of clothing into an outfit that you've never worn before, that's creativity. If you find a new route to the office, that's creativity. Okay? It's so hardwired into human beings that the idea of kind of making patterns that weren't there before, that there have been studies done where people are given a page of random numbers. Okay, so numbers that actually literally have no connection, and people will still find patterns in them. Your brain is wired that way. So take comfort from that. 2 is you have motivation. So the motives we're going to talk about, the implicit motives, and I'll explain more on that in a minute, are part of the mammal brain. It's not even the human brain, but the mammal brain. Seems to be linked to the limbic system. And in fact, we have specific neurochemicals that are attached to some of the motives I'm going to talk about. So that means we're going to see, those things are very concrete. They're very real, and they're in you. Different people have different motives, but there's things we expect to see in everyone. And no one would have been on this call if they had no motivation, right? 3rd, this is a partial quote from Rudyard Kipling in the Neolithic Age. And it's a quote I like to use a lot in these sessions, which is, there are 69 ways of constructing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. I have assessed and interviewed scores of writers myself. I have read how writers work, and hundreds of writers. I have done conferences. I have never found 2 writers who work exactly the same way. Not once, not ever. So the challenge here is that you are creative and you have motivation. The idea is find what works for you. I don't care what anybody says about how you have to write. I got really angry with one actually famous best-selling mystery author who wrote a book where she said you have to learn Latin in order to write. Well, that's just not true. And this is the person who had co-written books with her cat. So I had to wonder if the cat knew Latin. So my view is 69 ways, right? Find out what works. I was once on a panel with 2 writers who were really illustrate this. One was a thriller writer who said, you have to get up, you have to start writing at 9, you stop, you eat lunch, you go back to work. He kept pounding the table as he did this. You go back to work, you stop at 5, you walk the dog, you have dinner. That's the way it works. That's the way you have to do it. Now, I happen to know one of the other writers, and I turned to her and I said, so when do you start writing? She says, I usually start at about 3 a.m. when the TV stops showing TV shows. And he said, when do you mail your, when do you do your work? She says, well, I'm an astrologer, so I like mail my stuff at the times that the stars tell me are appropriate. Very different styles, but both were published writers. Okay. So, okay. Now, having said all that, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And so it does take a little work to make all this happen. But I just want you to feel empowered to do it. So now we're going to talk about motivation. All right. Why do people do what they do? And that's actually a question. And I don't know if anybody wants to try to put comments in the chat, but why do people do what they do? Why do you do what you do? When there are all sorts of, there's various things people do in their day, tasks, actions. Any thoughts? I have the chat window open, but I'm not seeing anything in it. So if nobody wants to respond, that's okay. But I just thought I'd try to see if anyone had any thoughts. To accomplish their
have
goal.
one.
Habit. Continuity. Yep. Loving what you do. And I have problems to solve. Yep, that's good. Because they love it. Okay. So we've got a couple of examples of people doing it because they're used to doing it. Habit. They feel they need to. Yeah. Or they admire it. Okay, that's good. Oh, that's a good one. Sometimes because they love it, and sometimes they have to do it. Or they're pressured into doing it. They have the passion to do it. Okay, this is a great list. Because what you'll notice is there's actually several different categories here if you kind of group these together. One is you have to do it or you're pressured into doing it. We call that extrinsic motivation, something outside you, making you do it. Other people are saying, well, you have to do it, or, and I think of this as, you need to do it. It's the only way you're going to solve your goals. You have decided it's important. So that's thinking you should. And that's what we call explicit motivation, or your values, or your identity, right? And then, if they don't have any other option, as someone just posted, that's extrinsic, right? They're being forced into it. It's not their choice. But if you think you should, you are choosing to do it because you think it's important. And then the third category, where people talk about passion and love, and that's wanting to do it, and that's implicit motivation. Right? They have desires and drives. This is basically it. These are the reasons why people do what they do. They do it because they have to. They're required by external forces. They think it's a good idea, and they've decided it's important, which is their values. Or they want to, and they love it. Or, to take the flip side, they're frustrated if they can't. Right? Because that's also part of the emotion. The flip side of the love is I can't not do it. Right? I've seen some writers refer to it as being almost an addictive process. So, in fact, science fiction writer Robert Heinlein talked about how it took more and more writing for him to get that warm feeling, which is like, that's sort of scary sounding, but But these are the three things we see in the literature. Extrinsic, which we're frankly not going to deal with because there's not a lot you can do about that. That's outside you. That's not inside you. All right. And then we're going to talk about what's inside you, the intrinsic motivations, both explicit and implicit. Okay. And there's some reasons why we want to look at both, but there's also a reason why we're going to focus a little more on implicit. And you guys are already anticipating some of it. So you say, okay, so what's the difference between them? Now, by the way, all this content is in the book. And so, you don't need to take copious notes if you don't want to, but this one's going to get a little complicated, so bear with me. Explicit motives. So these are things that we're going to call values. This is a traditional term in the academic literature. And then we're going to talk about implicit motives, which I like to call motives. All right. So what's the difference between them? Explicit motives are conscious. They are cognitive. They're kind of in the primate brain, the human brain. And as a consequence, they're easy to see and they're easy to describe. If I ask you what motivates you, that's what you're going to tell me. However, trying to take action based on that drains energy. Right? You are making yourself do something consciously. By contrast, implicit motives or motives are not conscious. If I ask people what their motives are, they'll tell me the conscious ones. They're emotional in nature. They're in the mammal brain. They're deeper. And that makes them harder to see and harder to describe. So you might know what you like, but it's typically much harder for you to know the patterns of what those are. But they provide energy, right? If you enjoy something, you'll make time for it, or you'll find energy to do it. So they generate energy. But because they're so deep, motives are slow to change. So they are what they are. You can develop them, but we're talking a process of years, not a process of days or weeks. And generally, I was part of a longitudinal study, or rather, I was one of the assessors in a longitudinal study where people had been assessed at age 12, 18, 31, and 41 on their motives. And what we found is they changed very little over time. So that's a pretty strong finding. So they're stable. This is why values can be important, because values are not that stable. And I don't mean to say that they just vary with the wind. You can have very strong and firmly held values that are constants in your life, but they are more adaptive. They're more additive. So for example, if when you get into a relationship with somebody, your priorities for what to do with your time change, right? Or if you have children, your priorities for Saturday night may change a lot, right? So I see parents are probably smiling at this. Maybe they're smiling, maybe they're crying. But the point is that values can be added on, right? You can say this is now important too, whereas the motives are sort of deep and general. Okay. Now, as a consequence, they predict different things. Values predict your choices. What am I doing today? What am I doing this quarter? What am I doing this year? Motives, remember, not conscious, so you're not always tapping into them. But when all else is equal, you tend to do something you like. So it predicts patterns of behavior over the long term. So you'll see people who say, one way that my late great mentor David McClellan put it, who was a giant of this field and taught me about motives, is that your achievement motive may cause you to go to higher education, but your values pick out what you want to study. So they both work together. So, and yes, and someone noted it will become a habit. It can become a habit. The values can become deep enough established that they become sort of stable, but they're still more adjustable than your implicit motives. So, now you may notice these are pretty different. Anyone care to guess what the correlation is between them? In other words, how similar are they in most people? Do they line up? Are they in opposition? Do they have nothing to do with each other? Is there a little correlation? Any thoughts? Someone suggested that motives shape values. Any other thoughts? Perpendicular. I'll tell you what the research says, that in general, they don't correlate at all. They have no relation to each other. Now, we do know that if you can line up your motives, your values, and your job, you're typically happier. But in fact, in general, they have no relation to each other at all. Remember, they're coming from different parts of the brain. And that actually is a good thing, because sometimes there are things you enjoy and there's things you don't. And how do you do the things that you don't enjoy? Values. Okay. So I'll give you an example of this. If you think of all the tasks you have in your day and how you prioritize them, right? And let's think about this just in a simple term, because there's far more nuance than this. If your values are high or low, and if the motives are high or low, in other words, if your value is high, it means it's important to me. If your motive is high on a task, that means I enjoy it. So where does something like that show on your priority list? A task that you both enjoy and is important, that appeals to motives and values? That's going to be top of your list, right? I mean, what's not to like? It's fun and it's important. The reverse is pretty clear cut. Low motivation, I don't enjoy it, and low value, and it's not important. Those things aren't even on your list, right? You usually fall off your list. But because these don't correlate with each other, right? I mean, they can line up or they can be different. You also get these other two boxes. So if the motive is high, it means I enjoy it, but the value is low. It means it's not important. So where do those things wind up on your priority list? What I find is these are the guilty pleasures. These are the things that you sneak in. They're not important, but you'll find time for them. Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Right? They really shouldn't be on your list, but you put them on. You'll find a way to get them in. Then there's the reverse of that. Low motive. I don't enjoy it, but it is important. And that can be doing paperwork, filling out your taxes, changing diapers, all things that you got to do, but that doesn't mean you enjoy the process. Okay. So where those go is usually not as high as they should, right? Or they'll go high on the list and you procrastinate. They drop down. Okay. So that's in a simple way, because of course there's degrees of enjoyment and degrees of importance. But what's more, it's actually more complicated than it appears here. It's possible that your context can change whether you think something is fun or not. So back in the day, back when people did their taxes on paper and sent them in, I knew a guy who hated filling out his tax paperwork. And he was the kind of guy who would go to the only late night post office in Boston at 11:59 p.m. of the very last day it was due in order to get a postmark on the envelope to prove that he'd actually gotten it done. He hated it so much. And then one day he got tax software, and it became a game. He loved playing with the numbers and seeing, oh, if I just change this, what happens? How much do I have to pay? How much can I change things? So even though technically it was the same task, paying your taxes, the nature of the task itself had changed enough that it moved from down here, I don't enjoy, to I enjoy it and it's important. And he would get it in quickly. So that's something to keep in mind, that sometimes there are obstacles to your writing that you might be able to restructure. You can help restructure the way you do things and the way you manage your life and your writing to make it easier for you. So let's think about it in terms of where does writing land for you, the act of writing. Because I often find a lot of people who are in these sessions are saying, I'd like to write more, or why aren't I writing as much as I want to? Or I want to write, but I just don't feel motivated, right? So if the act of writing itself, or some part of it, because there's parts that are more fun than others for people, is both enjoyable and important, right? High motive, high value, you'll keep writing, right? It's important. You know you want to do it and you enjoy it, so you're going to find time to do it. If you don't enjoy it and it's not important to you, that it's just not a big deal, then you won't write. And that's okay. I mean, not everybody has to write. But if on some level of you really want to write and you fall into one of these other two boxes, this is what part of this is about. So if you do enjoy it, but you don't value it, you may sneak in time to write, but you need to ask, why isn't it important? If you really love it that much, shouldn't it be important to you? And this is where you can kind of do what someone else suggested in the chat of use the motive to help rearrange your values. Remember, values are more adaptable. If the other is true, I don't enjoy it, it's really important to me, but I just don't seem to like it, you may be able to force yourself, but it's going to be hard to sustain. It's hard to keep writing. And then the question becomes, well, why don't you like it? And is it something that's fundamental? Or is it something like the guy who didn't want to do his taxes? Case in point for writing. One of the first writers I interviewed was Philip R. Craig, who writes books set outside Massachusetts and in oh god, I'm blanking on the name. The island out just off the coast. Anyway, he told me that he had decided to start writing, and he had studied other books and looked at how they were structured. He was an academic, and what he ultimately did was he would write a draft of a novel, and he would send it off to a publisher, or not to a publisher, sorry, to an agent, and he would frequently get a note back saying, "It's not there yet, but if you make these changes, we'll probably take it." And what he would do was start a new novel. Because at that point, he was using a typewriter. And the idea of having to retype 300 pages of manuscript was just killing him. He said getting a word processor changed his life because, sure, you can just go through and change the existing manuscript and just print it again. No big deal. You don't have to type all 75,000 words over again. So the same principle can apply in a lot of ways. He wound up publishing numerous books, but he had 10 different manuscripts he never sent off again because they were typed. So those are obstacles you can manage. Now, I'm going to note that, let me back up a second. So we've talked about the fact that, right, motives are stable, they're hard to change, so you need to kind of work around them. You kind of need to work with the motives you've got, right? So you may be asking, well, how many motives are there? And so I'm going to run ahead again on this. All right. In 1938, Henry Murray, who sort of created the field of motivational psychology, identified a lot of different things from his clinical work, which he called needs. Fortunately for the rest of us, the late great David McClelland, who, as I said, was a giant of the field and my mentor, found that only 3 of them account for 85% of daily thinking time. So those are the 3 that are the most important. Everything else fits into that other 15%. I will note here that we're talking about you as people and writers, but this is also true for characters. So you can also use things like motives and values contrast to help create a character, right? What if somebody has strong values here, but strong motives there? That's interesting. But these are the 3. And I'll go into a little more detail as to what they are. But first I need to say, everyone has all 3. It's a matter of degree. And they are all relatively stable over time. So the 3 are achievement motive, which is really about efficiency and innovation. The names are all bad. Labels are the bane of my existence. Someone with a lot of achievement motive is energized by meeting and beating goals, by personally improving the way things are done, by doing and learning new things, because that helps them do things better. Right? This is the motive you see in entrepreneurs. It's the motive you see in accountants. It's the motive you see finance people, salespeople, scientists, engineers are people who get excited about making things better, hands-on, often as well. Then we have affiliation motive. So affiliation motive is about belonging, wanting friendship, being part of a group. This is personal relationships, not professional ones. So people with this are energized by getting along, belonging to a group, having personal relationships, engaging socially, and generally just being friendly. It doesn't mean you have to be a social butterfly. You could have like 2 friends that you've kept since grade school. So, sorry, can everyone still hear me? Okay, good. My phone rang, sorry. So affiliation motive is about being friendly and protecting relationships. Influence motive, and these are in alphabetical order, by the way, there's no particular reason for the order, is about impact and influence. So people with a lot of this are energized by having an impact on or influence on other people, groups, the world at large. They want to have an impact. Okay. And that can include people like coaches and managers, executives. But what's interesting is we also know that they correlate with what you like to read. Okay. So people with a lot of achievement motive, let me go back a second. You may be wondering, how do we measure this non-conscious thing if we can't ask you? The way we do it is we show people a picture like this one. There are pictures in the book, by the way, and say, write a story. Something that's a lot of fun for many writers. What do you see here? So if you guys will just take a minute. Now I'll tell you what some people write stories about. This is a guy working late trying to create something anew, say a new bridge design that will be better and more efficient than any other bridge design and use metal better than other bridges that went before it. What motive does that sound like? Oh, I'll just save you the time. It's achievement motive, right? So
Achievements.
making things better. Someone else will write, this guy, people don't believe the way he designs bridge. He's an architect, but he's got a new technique and people don't believe that his method works. So he's going to prove it to them. He's going to show the world that his is the best, and he's going to prove to them and win awards and be famous, which is more about influence. It's also got some achievement because I let it slip in there. A third person might say, this guy is working late at night and he misses his family. He just wants to go home. And that would be affiliation, right? So what's interesting about this is these are called projective tools because you project yourself into it. I don't tell you what to write. You write what comes to mind first. And that's coming out of what feels right to write, what you enjoy writing. Okay? So given that, more pictures like this, so just so you know. We did motivational diagnostics here. Okay, this is my one-page summary of 70 years of motive research. Dave McClelland is spinning in his grave even as we speak. But and this is again in the book, but this is just a guide, a high-level guide to thinking about motives. Remember, you've got all three. It's a question of degree, so some might be more stronger than others. And I just want to call out one particular piece. This is what people read. People with a lot of achievement motive tend to like to read how-to books to get better at something. Or if they read fiction, they tend to read things like puzzle mysteries, like Agatha Christie's, where the challenge is figuring out the answer more than it is other issues. For example, down in people with a lot of affiliation will tend to read novels about relationships or romances or rom-coms, right? This applies to movies as well. And people with a lot of influence, they may read about history and psychology to understand, how do I influence people better? Theology, the ultimate power relationship. And thrillers, which often like big political conflicts or leaders' biographies or hard-boiled crime novels. Note that you have some mysteries fall up here and some fall down here. And some are actually kind of in the middle. And there's an argument, since my wife writes murder mysteries, there's an argument in the field for many years of which are better, the hard-boiled detective or the cozy traditional mystery. And of course, the answer is neither one, right? It's what appeals to you. And people have rationalized why what they like is somehow better. But the truth is, it's just all better. And it's all whatever suits you. So that's part of the thing to keep in mind. So when I started looking at writers, my thought was, well, there's probably going to be a correlation. Mystery writers are probably going to want to have a little more achievement, right? And thriller writers have a little more influence. And I was wrong. I started with a group of 25 writers, traditionally published at book length across genres. We had nonfiction, mystery, thrillers, romance writers, and science fiction writers of varying stripes, and so a pretty wide range. And then I followed up with scores of people since, many other people. In fact, my most recent was a few months ago. I worked with a writers group that was meeting in Luxembourg, and it included people like playwrights as well as writers of books. and I got the same results. Right? The original hypothesis was that motives correlate with genre. They don't. In fact, there is one motive that absolutely seems to dominate in novel length works. And that, anyone care to guess? It's influence. This is the average profile of my first 25 published writers. And I will note most of the ones I've looked at since. Those are percentiles. So higher than 88% of the population on influence. And the reason for this is simple. People write because they want people to read it. They want to influence people. Fair enough? Now, that doesn't mean you have to have this profile to write. Although I'm going to guess a lot of the folks on this call actually probably do have this profile or something similar to it. You can have others. And remember, I was looking at novel length writers, book length writers, which is kind of the highest standard, right? I mean, maybe you only have enough motive to write short stories. That's fine. I don't care. I don't judge, right? So, and one of the people, even in my first 25, actually had high achievement and high influence. And what's interesting about her is she had been a ghostwriter. So she wrote the book with somebody else. And in a sense, the achievement went into making sure she got it right for the client. And the influence motive was her writing, her own personal writing. When I interviewed her, she had done several co-written. She was working on her first solo novel. So we talked about kind of how to make sure that could work for her. But that wasn't all of it. There was one other factor I found in writers, which is worth pointing out. You see. And to this, I'm going to have to get into a little geeky stuff on statistics, so forgive me. There's a thing we call activity inhibition, and it's the degree to which you can channel your motives. Right? If you think about it, we're talking about these as emotional energy sources. So that means your impulses, being impulsive, comes out of your motives, certain kinds of impulses, I should say. If you have a lot of activity inhibition, it means you can kind of hold off and channel it into a more positive path, right? So you can restrain it. Now, the average score in the US is about 1.75. In the UK, it's about 3.5. And everybody else pretty much ranges between that. Actually, in some Romance language countries, it's actually lower. Significantly above average is 2. Now, significantly above average in statistical terms means 1 standard deviation above the mean. And that puts you at about 84th percentile. So if you have 1.75, you're average. 0.25 is enough to move you up a standard deviation. Another 0.25 would put you up into the top like 97 odd percent. If you had 2 points, so that's 2.25. 2.5 would put you up into 99.9%. Now, here's what I found in the writers I've been studying. Writers in my first batch averaged 18 on this. That's 65 standard deviations above the mean. In other words, writers can really postpone impulse or immediate satisfaction. And I thought, what does this mean? I'd never seen anything like this. And fortunately, my mentor was still around at the time. And I asked him, I was like, Dave, what the heck does this mean? It doesn't make any sense. He says, no, it makes perfect sense. He said, an ordinary person gets mad at you, they hit you. A writer gets mad at you, they sit down and take a year to write a book to kill you off. And he's right. He was absolutely right. Case in point, my wife, Toni, wrote a book killing off her ex-boyfriend in her 4th novel, 10 years after we'd been married. And we dated for 6 years before we got married. So that's pretty patient for waiting to get your revenge. By the way, she said she rewrote that scene numerous times because it had to be just right. So, but what's interesting about this, a couple ways it says, okay, so writers can take their impulses and channel it into sitting down and writing. And Rula, thank you. It's the number of knots and apostrophe T's in the picture stories I was talking about. No grudges, no. Um, but so the point to remember here is you have to channel your emotions. Now, remember, these were book length. Not everyone has to be at this high level, but it is something to keep in mind that channeling the emotions is what's going to enable you to sit down and finish. And the longer the work you do, kind of the more patience you need. And when my initial 25 was kind of the old days of publishing, where you had to take the better part of a year to get an agent, and then it took a better part of a year to get a book published. Well, things have changed. It's a lot easier to get things up. So people with lower AI, and I've talked to a few, sometimes they say, well, the heck with this, I'm just going to publish online. Okay, that's fine. There are other prices you pay for doing that, but that's a way of getting around this trait. The key message here, though, is you've got to channel your motives. And how do we channel motives? Through goals. I'm going to have to move quickly through this because otherwise we're not going to get to creativity. So I'm going to just tell you a really good example, which is my wife. And so I'm picking on her because she's given me permission to use these stories. But she's not the only person who does this. When she first started writing, she had a full-time job. So she didn't have a lot of time to write. So she decided, how much could I write in like a single session in an evening? We didn't have kids yet. It was about 600 words. She said, okay, I'm going to write 600 words a day. And actually, I need to back up a second. She said, I had suggested that one thing she could do back when she said, how do I finish? I said, keep track of your words because you want feedback. It's satisfying to know you've made progress towards your goal. She said, well, how long is a novel? Well, a short genre fiction novel at that point was about 65 to 75,000 words. Okay. Now, if I tell you you have to write a 72,000 word novel, you have 1 year, go. That sounds kind of terrifying, right? Well, let's break it down. 72,000 words a year is 6,000 words a month. About average of 30 days a month, that's 200 words a day. You probably write emails longer than that. 200 words is just a couple of paragraphs. Can you write 200 words a day? Sure you can. Part of the idea here is to chunk it out. What Toni did was she decided she was going to write 600 words a day, 4 days a week. But here's the clever part. She gave herself a fallback because sometimes you have, yes, thank you, Ray. Virginia Woolf wrote 2 pages each day. Other people do different things. Some people work 4 hours a day. Isaac Asimov wrote 10 hours a day and 8 on weekends, but he was unusual. There are some people who said, I don't believe you can write for more than 2 hours a day. And it almost doesn't matter. What matters is you chunk it out. Toni's fallback, I should mention, what she had, because 600 words 4 days a week works out to 2,400 for the whole week. So she said, in case she had a really bad week, she could make it up on Sunday. She gave herself a fallback goal. As long as she had 2,400 words by the end of the week, didn't matter how she got there. And then over time, I'm going to skip ahead. Well, she changed it. And I'll tell you why. This is based on a research by Yerkes and Dodson, which I think is really, really important to help you manage yourself and actually, frankly, to manage others. So Yerkes and Dodson were researchers in the early part of the 20th century. And they put in, what they did is they set up a situation with a cage, the short stick just in reach, a long stick just out of reach, and a banana. And then they put a monkey in the cage. Now, they put a monkey in the cage who was full. He had just eaten. So what do you think he did about the banana? Nothing. Right? He wasn't interested in it. He wasn't motivated to go get it. Then they put a monkey in the cage who hadn't eaten in 4 hours. So, it's lunchtime. And what he did was he sort of looked at it. He went and grabbed the stick and he realized, I can't reach it with the short stick. Wait, I can get the long stick. So he used the short stick to get the long stick, and he used the long stick to get the banana, which is pretty good analytical reasoning for a chimpanzee. Okay. Then they put a monkey in the cage who hadn't eaten in 24 hours. He was ravenous. He just reached for it. Couldn't get it. Eventually, not soon, saw the short stick, grabbed the short stick. Still couldn't get it. Got angry. Threw the stick at the banana. Okay? Now, what Yerkes and Dodson discovered back in 1908 was that there is a relationship, I should say, between your emotional arousal, that's a technical term, and your performance, but it's not a straight line. It's a bell curve, right? So the point here is that some people will say shoot for the moon and you'll land among the stars, and it's like, well, besides that being terrible astronomy, it doesn't work. If you set goals so high that people know they're going to fail, that is not motivating. If the goals are too easy, they're not motivating. So that's the full monkey. If the goals are too high or too anxiety provoking, they create more anxiety than they do performance, because the emotions fill your brain. So the best place to be is just excited enough where you are challenged. So if you've ever read anything about flow experience by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I practiced that name. What he found was that it's got to be a balance between challenge and ability. And that puts you at that magic point, and people are at their most productive when they have not a perfect chance of success, but it's a worthwhile challenge. And for most people, that means somewhere between 70 to 80% chance of success for meeting a goal. For Toni, when she started out, it was 600 words a day, 4 days a week. But she got faster. Then it became 800 words a day, 4 days a week. And then she quit her job and became a full-time writer, and she eventually got up to 1,000 words a day, every day, because she got more skilled and she got faster and she had more time. Then we had a baby. Well, actually, before I tell you that, I want to tell you a different story. There was a point where we had 2 deaths in the family in the same month, and it was bad. And Toni was on deadline. And there's nothing we could do about that. We just had to do what we had to do. But we finally got back, and she got back down to the keyboard, and she said, I'm not going to make this goal this deadline, unless I write 2,000 words a day. And I said, have you ever written 2,000 words a day? And she said, well, I think so. Probably once or twice, maybe. And I said, okay. She was already writing 1,000 words a day at that point. From the second she set that goal, here's how many she wrote. Zip. 0. None. The anxiety about trying to do it and her feeling that she set too high a goal and she pushed herself over the top of the bell curve, which made it worse because every day that went past, she was 2,000 words further behind. So one night we had a discussion about this, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do, because the emotion was high. And I said, okay, I'm going to have a suggestion for you, and it's going to sound crazy, but you have to bear with me. I said, do not set a goal of 2,000 words a day. But I have to. I said, wait for it. Set 2 1,000 word goals a day. $2,000 a day, but in 2 goals, not 1. You may say, what's the difference? The difference is she knew she could do 1,000 words a day. And then the second 1,000 became the challenging part. And I could see her process. So that means she got a victory, at least 1 victory a day. Right? So it was challenging, but it no longer seemed impossible. And I could see her emotions dropping as she pondered this. And she said, I think I can do this. So it doesn't matter how you do it, right? 1,000 in the morning, 1,000 in the evening. I don't care how you structure it. But the point here is that chunking out goals can actually lead you to a higher level. She actually did hit 2,000 words most days, but it was enough to keep her motivated until ultimately she finished the book. She was a little late, but it was acceptably late. It was within limits of reason. They could still get it published on time. So goals are funny because this is not something that is fixed in stone. It's something that can transform and change over time. You just need to set your goals. I'm going to skip this. I'm talking about rational goals. Rational goals or smart goals can sometimes be demotivating because then it feels like one more damn thing you have to do, and thus it becomes a value, not emotional driving. But if it's part of a bigger, more ambitious goal, something that excites you, it's going to work better. So my suggestion here is you writing 600 words a day. It's not about the words. It's about getting to the novel at the end. Okay, so keep that in mind. These are the rules I came up with. I call them laws of the balance point because what the heck, I'm writing the book. I got to write my own laws. One is different people need different goals. So Raymond Harrison mentioned Virginia Woolf wrote 2 pages each day. Some people wrote 20 pages a day. Some people write 600 words a day. It's what works for you. Remember, 9 and 60 ways of constructing tribal lays. 2 is that challenging and realistic depend on your perceptions, no one else's. Case in point, I worked with a woman who came up to me after a session like this and said, I have a terrible fear of the blank page. And I had to write a dissertation, a doctoral dissertation. And it's like, oh boy, I feel your pain there. I had a 217-page dissertation with 65 tables. Yeah. And she said, I had to set myself a goal that I was willing to face. She said, I wrote 1 sentence a day. And she said, and I didn't stop with 1 sentence, you understand. But that was all I could face without it terrifying me. And she finished it. All right. So challenging and realistic depend on your perceptions, and you need a goal that works for you. But the balance point, what becomes anxiety provoking or not, changes because of external issues. So when we had children, Toni for a while was afraid she couldn't write anymore. And the reason was she wasn't getting any sleep and she was getting awakened, and we had this small noisy thing around the house, right? And I had to say, Toni, you can't expect to write 1,000 words a day when we've got a new baby. And she's like, oh yeah. But people sometimes aren't good at kind of acknowledging that. There's a lot of writers who talked about how the pandemic has affected them because there's this constant background of stress, which automatically pushes you up that bell curve, right? The balance point can also change based on internal issues. For example, I mentioned as Toni got faster, she set the goal higher because it was less anxiety provoking. So the key message under all of this is to give yourself flexibility in your goal setting. Set what works and adjust it as necessary. Okay. Rula has mentioned a line that I love talking about, that Jane Austen wrote all those incredibly, insanely complex and sophisticated novels like a phrase at a time. In passing, she had a blank book set on a sideboard. Worked for her. So don't beat yourself up if you don't write from 9 to 5. So some summations here. Motives can send you towards or away from writing. Goal setting can improve your odds of success if you pick them well. And try to avoid valuing or measuring things that get in your way. So I knew a guy who was keeping track of all the cups of coffee he drank and cigarettes he smoked while working on his novel. Well, those things don't have anything to do with producing words. He never finished that novel. And it's like, who cares? Keep track of the words or the pages or the scenes. Again, whatever works. And if you can structure your writing life to support your motivation, that helps. All right, so I'm running a little slower than I had intended to. By the way, I'm just going to note here that some stories appear to be universal because they appeal to all 3 motives. So I'm just going to say this. The Wizard of Oz, you have the Scarecrow, who wants to solve problems, the Tin Man, who wants love, and the Cowardly Lion, who wants to be a leader. There you go. Achievement, affiliation, influence. Harry Potter. Hermione is the smart one who solves things. Ron is the loyal friend, and Harry is the leader. Again, achievement, affiliation, influence. Right? Star Trek's a little different because Kirk is the leader. Spock is the brain who is trying to solve the problems, and McCoy is the person who is referencing how people feel. So that's influence, achievement, affiliation. I don't think that's an accident. It doesn't mean you have to do it this way, but it might explain why some stories are more broadly popular. So I did say we can talk about this in terms of writing characters as well as working with yourself. So let's take a little bit to talk about creativity, and then we'll open it up for all questions. I use a very simple definition that was created by David Perkins, which I find is enormously helpful. It's generate and select. So I mentioned that, creativity is about making links between things that weren't linked. So the generator is you make progressively more distinct links. Contrary to popular belief, most people do not get a bolt from the blue. And what usually happens is they may not even be aware of it. Behind the scenes, they are making links that connect, or they've gathered enough information that suddenly the whole picture becomes clear. One of the classic examples of this is Darwin. Darwin claimed that it was after rereading Malthus's book on populations that he suddenly got the idea for natural selection, and he described it as a lightning bolt. As it happens, he left very detailed notebooks, where he listed his thoughts for the day, what he was reading, day by day. And Howard Gruber went and investigated this because he was a researcher into creativity. And he found the day that Darwin read Malthus again. And what he had in the comments? Nothing. If you read his books, the idea of evolution actually, wait for it, evolved over time in bits and pieces. In retrospect, he remembered it as being sudden, but it really wasn't. So you don't have to, because I know people who said, well, if it doesn't come as a bolt from the blue, it's not that creative. It's like, that's not the way it works at all. What actually happens is you make more and more distant links, and then the selector is, okay, there's a place where you have to stop. So this is an example. I'm using murder mysteries because for some reason there's a lot of them around the house. The butler did it. Okay, too obvious. Butler, murder, right. Everyone, that's a joke. The butler didn't do it. Okay, that's one step further. Still not all that exciting. Let's generate another step. The butler did do it, but he's trying to cover it up. Yeah, well, okay, hackneyed, but we're getting there. The butler didn't do it, but he's trying to make people think he did. Okay, that has some potential, because then you have the question of, well, why does he want to do that? Why does he want to get arrested for a crime he didn't commit? The butler did do it, but he's trying to make people think he did by pretending unrealistically that he did. Okay, now we're getting a little out of control. Now it's time to select. Okay? So the generator is, let's keep moving further out. And the selector is, let's decide where to stop. And that actually, I think, is a very useful way of thinking about creativity. And you see a lot of writers who talk about, they sort of slowly, meticulously kind of figure out, that's not interesting enough. I'm going to go a step further. Okay? You see this a lot in science fiction. They kind of go one step beyond the obvious. One book I found particularly impressive at this, and the butler knows who did it, indeed. Yes, and Agatha Christie plots, it is somebody, Glenda Camino notes, is the step 5. Sometimes they are, yes, and she can pull them off, but not everybody can. So that's about you, right? I was thinking one book that particularly impressed me as an example of this was World War Z. World War Z is a novel about the zombie apocalypse, except it's not just, oh, look, zombies and we're all dying. He took it across years, when it started, events in the middle, how they developed it, how they fought the zombies, and how they ended the zombie war. So he took it like multiple steps away from what most people even touch. I'm not a big fan of zombie works. That impressed me. That was good. So it's all a matter of choice and execution. Okay. Now, having said that, I want to spend a little time on, since we've talked about it, the 7 deadly myths of creativity. and I've designated these, there may be others, but here's the ones I found a lot. One is that heredity. Creativity is born, not made. Well, yes, technically, in that everyone is born with it, right? You don't have to be born Shakespeare. Second, the muse. I forget if I checked this up to animate properly. Oops. Yes, yeah, you've already got it. And you can develop your creativity, by the way. The more you practice it, the better it gets. And the more you learn about an area, the more connections you can make, right? And then there's the muse. I must wait on my muse. I must wait to get the gift from the heavens. Nonsense. You don't need a muse. Peter DeVries once wrote, I only write when I'm inspired, and I see to it that I'm inspired at 9 a.m. every morning. Okay. There are numerous other writers who talk about, I don't need the proper slanting of light to come into the room to do my writing. There's a reason why lawyers and journalists often wind up writing novels. It's because they get used to just generating tons of prose and they rechannel it into fiction because they're used to it. I don't need it good. I need it Tuesday, right? Solitude. I have to be alone to write. This can be helpful. I don't want to underestimate that, but you don't. Isaac Asimov, when he started out, was working in his family's candy store, and he just learned to be interruptible. He learned to just hold on to the thought and keep writing. Other people, that's trickier. We know that it can take about 20 minutes of uninterrupted time to get to flow experience, which is certainly faster. But it doesn't mean you can't write if you have people in the house, right? Then there's discipline. I must be disciplined. So when I ask writers, how are they successful? There's a lot of writers who will say, I don't know, I guess I must be disciplined. I don't know is a clue that it's actually their motives. Discipline is fine. Discipline is how you get through the off days. But motivation beats discipline every time. If you want to do it, you'll make it happen. Whereas otherwise, you're draining your energy to force yourself. And if you don't have a lot of energy to spare, which a lot of people don't in these pandemic days, you're not going to do it. Then there's similarity. So I have to do it like so-and-so or I'm not a real writer. I said, ask Mozart and Beethoven. There are two categories of creative process which have been described in the literature as by that I mean academic literature, as Mozartian and Beethovenian. Okay? Mozart would put it all together in his head and then just boom, lay it out. First draft. Made very few changes. Beethoven would tinker and edit and change and adjust, and his worksheets are just almost impossible to read because he kept making changes and alterations. There is no difference in quality between the Mozartian and the Beethovenian. Zero. It's like saying who's better, Mozart or Beethoven. They're both good. In writing, there might be people like Rex Stout, who wrote the Nero Wolfe Mysteries, who tended to write first draft, but he spent time thinking about it. He was doing the editing in his head, and then he'd write it. Other people edit and edit and edit and edit and edit. That's fine. But the larger point is you don't have to do it like anyone else. You don't have to write the same length, the same time, the same style, the same anything. Most writers start out imitating somebody they admire, but that doesn't mean you have to imitate everything. So the sixth, spontaneity or completeness. The idea that if it doesn't come naturally or instantly, it can't be all that creative. Well, that's where the generate and select comes into play, right? Creativity is incremental, whether you know it or not, whether you see it or not. So, you don't have to, this is also sometimes a flip side of the muse. If it doesn't come suddenly or you're given a gift, it's not there. The best stuff is somehow instantaneous. That's not true. You could have really boring ideas that happen to you all at once. So, and then there's the last is about worthiness or belonging. And somehow it's not right for me to consider myself a writer because I may know of these writers or I've heard of these writers. I don't belong in that group. I'm not like them. John Steinbeck nailed it. He's like, I can't be Shakespeare. We already have a Shakespeare. We don't need another one. You can be you. One definition I like to use is something that goes way back from a Greek writer, which is a writer writes. That's the only definition. So don't let these things get in your way. So, Paula Messina noted that Michael Bracken sent off a story he started 19 years ago. Well, you know what? I can meet that. My second mystery short story was one I started. The earliest draft I have was 18 years old. And I would come back to it periodically and eventually got it to the point where I mailed it off and I got it into Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine. It's not a race. Finnegan's Wake took 17 years. So just the flip side of this is, so what is useful for creativity? So some principles you might want to keep in mind. One is incrementalism. Generate, select, and then generate some more if you need to, right? Don't worry about that. It's not, no one sees anything but the last draft, right? And then volume. Some people like to overwrite and then edit down type. Other people like to write a bare bones and then expand on it. Either one is fine. But overwriting. There's a joke between me and Toni is that for like her first 10 books, she always wrote this one scene at the beginning, which she would have to cut. Every time. She would write the same kind of scene and I don't need this, and would cut it. And eventually she got to the point where she didn't need to write it. She would cut it before she wrote. But then there's brainstorming. So there's one writer, Gary Gravel, I believe it was, who referred to creating, it made him nervous to put anything down in print. Even a first draft was too anxiety provoking. So he designated a 0 draft. And the idea was, this is where I brainstorm. I've got no requirements for this. Or you can create lists of things or do your research. Don't edit too soon. There are people who, and I've got a quote from one in the book who I'm just blanked on his name, where he rewrote the first chapter so many times that it was perfection and he never got to chapter 2. It's better to kind of write it and then edit it than get stuck on chapter 1. This is one thing where, if you know about Nanowrimo, November Novel Writers Month, I think it's been a great thing. The idea is that in the month of November, you have to write 50,000 words. They don't have to be good. The point is to just write 50,000 words. And I see a lot of people on the internet doing this as we're starting to get towards November. And what it does is it kind of demythologizes writing vast amounts of stuff. Someone comes out and says, wow, I write 50,000 words. They're not good words. But what if I worked at it? No, and Sandra Alexander points out that she gives herself permission to write rubbish at any time, but then you have something to revise, right? It's easier to edit than it is to come up with something from scratch. And workshopping can help too. Sarah Smith is a master workshopper, and I have research that I did with the Cambridge Science Fiction Writers Workshop in the book, which I thought had a really good set of principles, which actually align with research that's been done into top team effectiveness. Then I mentioned exploration, elaboration. Follow an idea out to a logical conclusion, and then a step further, and then a further than that. That gets people's attention. Got mine. And I said, revision. You're not limited to your first idea or your second or your 52nd. And it's not a race. We got ahead on that one. As I mentioned, I published a short story 18 years after my first draft. So these are all practical things you can do. But remember, it's whatever works for you. Okay? There are other tricks, right? People only see the last draft. Some people collect commonplace books. In other words, they get ideas and they write them down. Or I put things in my phone. I may not use them, but it gives me something to go look to when I'm feeling dry. There's a joke in the creativity literature of the 3 B's of creativity: bed, bath, and bus. Frederick Brown was a mystery and science fiction author who would get on literally a bus in the middle of Arizona and just go someplace boring. And he found it triggered he kind of made ideas up to fill the gap. It said that Einstein used to have to be very careful shaving because he'd get his best ideas while shaving and he'd jump and cut himself. Right? If that works. Free writing. That's just randomly writing stuff until something hits. Toni actually wanted to write science fiction at first. And then she said, she said, I wrote some stuff and it was terrible. And one day I did a free writing experiment, and she started writing about North Carolina, which is where she grew up, and writing because she had moved north to Boston. So now, she was really seeing North Carolina in a different way. And I decided, well, it's in the present day. It must be a mystery. That became her first book. And of course, practice. And also, the write what you know is almost an eighth myth. Because obviously, there's a lot of science fiction writers who don't write anything like what we see in daily life. But the idea is that if you amass information, it's easier to make connections between them, even if you use it to go someplace radically different. So those are all just some practical tips. So now I think I'm going to stop here. We can open up to questions. We still got 17 minutes. So I apologize for going over that time, but I was hoping that's useful.
Thank you. That was very useful, actually. That was very inspiring and motivating. So, and I think many of us got to kind of think about what motivates us. What type of people are we? Are we motivated by affiliation, by achievement, or by influence? So, and sometimes the results can be a bit surprising, actually. So I've read the book. I was telling Steve before when we were backstage. So in the book, there's this test early on. I think it's maybe in the first 1/3 of the book, where you get to tick some of the things that you like to do, and then you count how many you got in each category, and you see which one is you. I was very surprised with the results, but then, the more I read into it and the more I was thinking about me and how I function, it actually makes a lot of sense. So Dr. Kelner, thank you. This is a very, very brilliant book, and I would highly recommend it to everybody. So I'm gonna leave the floor now okay, do we have any?
We had a question.
Right, we have comments, but if anyone would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand icon, and then we can call on you to use the mic. Because there are tons of comments, and I don't think we can go through all of them. So
yeah, I see one question I do want to address that's already here,
okay.
which is, if someone is a beginner but was forced to type a specific amount of words, do you not think that this pressures beginners? And this always happens in educational institutions. I actually do agree with that. And I found it interesting that when I first took expository writing as an undergraduate, they started with short pieces and then gradually lengthened it. So there's something here around how it's done. The counterpoint to that is you might be able to do more than you think. So this is, again, put on the bell curve, right? You need to try it, and then you might lose the anxiety over doing it. But it is an issue. Sorry, carry on. Any others?
Let's see. Okay, lots of thanks. Glenda's hand is up.
Okay, I don't know if this is a problem anybody else has or not, but sometimes I'll work out the characters, and maybe it's based on a historical character or situations actually happened. I do a lot of research. I do years of research. I put together the story. I finish it in my head, and I think if I write it, it'll just be a slog because I've already got out of it what I wanted to get for myself. Then I don't.
You're not the only person who experiences that. Actually, I've experienced that. I once wrote a novel out with such a detailed outline that I didn't want to write the novel anymore. I had lost the pressure. So some people, they talk about pantsers versus planners. Someone who writes by the seat of their pants versus someone who plans. If you're more of a pantser and you get more of your energy out of that, it might be more productive for you to just do the research, but don't write the story. Do that live. In other words, just sit down and kind of flow. Does that make sense? I mean, you can try it. I'll tell you, I actually experimented with this myself because I usually would write different chunks of work and slowly weave it together across a plot. And then I actually wrote a novel where I just decided I'm going to start writing from page 1 to page X, and I'm not going to go back and edit until I've finished a complete draft. And it turned out I could do that, which was something of a surprise to me. So you may need to kind of, adjust, or you set it aside until you're interested enough to do it again. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, once I was working with a fellow writer. We were trying to write a play together, and he was a pantser and I was a planner, and we could not work together. We just simply couldn't make it work.
Yeah, I could see that. You have to structure it really carefully. Maybe you get the planner to lay out the frame, and then the pantser can write the pieces or whatever. But
have to
I've seen
motivate
people.
myself to
Yeah,
want
I've
to
talked to
share
people
it.
who have this. This is definitely a real issue. So if that's any comfort. Sorry. Oh, I see someone
Right.
asked what kills
Yeah.
motivation.
Yes.
An excellent question. One thing that kills motivation is extrinsic motivation. There have been studies on this where people were told you're going to sit down and do a research study, but the researcher isn't here yet, so here's some games to play while you wait. And it was little finding words in pictures exercises. And what happened was, after like 30 minutes, the researcher came in and said, okay, this was actually the research. We're going to pay you for how many of these you went through. Some people refused the money because suddenly it went from being fun to being a job. Now, let me be very clear. I'm going to quote another famous writer who said, only a fool writes except for money. I'm not saying you shouldn't be paid. What I'm saying is you need to make sure that it's still satisfying to you emotionally, because otherwise when the pay disappears, so will your job. So, or your motivation. I knew a writer who was, she wrote romantic thrillers, and she was really good at it. And she wrote about women who were living in abusive relationships and had to escape with their children. This came from personal life. She was in a terrible marriage. And this is how she managed to vent so she could just stay sane. Over time, she got more and more successful, and she finally got a $100,000 contract, which gave her the freedom to leave her husband and take her daughter. And then she couldn't finish the book. She kind of lost that extrinsic motive. Now, there is a happy story to this, a happy ending to this. Over time, she kind of re-entered herself into writing for its own sake. First, she started out writing reviews for Romantic Times magazine, and then she started building back up and started to write fiction again. So she kind of reconnected with the joy of writing rather than writing because she had to. So what kills motivation sometimes is actually getting paid the wrong way, perhaps. But your motives don't go away just because you're not using them. And that's important to remember. Paula?
Mhm.
Okay.
We have
wait,
a comment. Oh, yes.
Now,
Sorry.
if you have lost your joy of writing, do you have any suggestions on how to recapture it?
It's a great question. And it's one that's a lot of writers in the pandemic are asking right now. I think sometimes you need to let it go for a while. And don't if you put pressure on yourself to do it, then again you're kind of forcing yourself into it, and that's going to stress you out. Or do something radically different that no one expects you to do. So write in a different genre, or write poetry. I think you just need to find something that it's totally untainted by anything else that might have been getting you down. And just slowly, and don't set high expectations. Don't say, well, I've written mysteries my whole life, I'm going to try writing a science fiction novel. Just start small. Free write. And try to get back into what you like about writing in the first place. And be patient. Be patient with yourself. Sorry, Rula, you said
Yes.
there was
I was just gonna comment on something you just said, something about writing poetry and people in the pandemic, complaining about this issue. I can relate to that. I mean, I can say that poetry really helped in, if you want to call it, building the stamina of getting back into, writing longer things. So that was very, very helpful. And the comments, yes, we've got comments flowing into the chat box. Sarah Smith, writer Sarah Smith, hi. Sarah says, if I don't have some form of outline, I'll happily noodle on with a scene for pages and pages and pages, and it won't fit into the bigger structure at all. So I do my outline to remind me what I'm doing and persuade myself I know what I'm doing. But the scenes one by one can be very pantser. So the scenes one by one can surprise me.
So there's an issue here around how detailed is your outline, right? And for some people, they write an outline that's so detailed that the only thing they lack is dialogue. That to me is boring. But there are other writers who do scene cards. I'm dating myself here. Jeremiah Healy, who was a Boston area mystery writer, he was a law professor, and he's one of the most organized people I've ever met. He would start with the closing scene he wanted to have written, and he would write that down on a card. And then he would write, okay, what's the scene that has to happen before that scene? And he would write a little card, just making notes. It was just an outline. And he'd eventually work all the way back to the beginning of the book and have a stack of cards. And then he would write the prose forward. So that worked for him. But he also was writing scene outlines, or people can do chapter outlines. I will say Toni hates doing outlines, and she's had to write them when she's put together book proposals. But she always gives herself permission to completely abandon the outline. That's another trick, is that you do an outline and then you realize the outline's not going to work. You don't have to deal with that. One of the folks in Sarah Smith's group was actually David Alexander Smith, actually used to write an outline, and then as he made changes, he would change the outline too. That's a level of detail I can't deal with, but it worked for him. So, right? So some of this is about throwing out ideas that may or may not work for you, just to be clear. Yeah. I see Paula's raising her hand.
Hold on.
I just wanted to comment. I wanted to comment on Sarah's writing. She is writing a book now that is so complicated. I can't imagine how she could write it without an outline. I, on the other hand, am more of a pantser. And if I do any outlining, it's in my head, not usually on paper. But Sarah's writing this book that's unbelievable.
She writes
Really
very
complicated.
intricately researched historical novels, among
Yes,
other
and
things.
that's,
So
yeah.
that
Her
depends on what you're
book
writing.
is so complex.
Yeah. So, but it depends on what you're writing. Some things could be a push. I mean, Lord of the Rings was completely written by the seat of the pants. He went back and rewrote it. So
Wow.
just keep in mind. Yeah. So almost anything you can cite, I can cite a counterexample just because writers are so all over the map. So
How about like, for example, if you're writing a novel and sometimes you hear many writers saying that they get bored during the process. A good tip would be, and you also mentioned this in the book, Steve, a good tip would be to write about the exciting scenes that you're not there yet, but you might want to anticipate something happening, and you write about it. You write about the stuff that excites you, and then you sort of work your way towards it. That also helps in increasing the motivation.
yeah. And sometimes what writers have done is written all the interesting scenes and realized they didn't need the boring
Yeah.
scenes.
Uh-huh. So then use them just as fillers, to kind of connect the dots.
They need to connect them, but
Between
sometimes the
the-
connection
yeah.
gets more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have to write in order either.
Yeah. Actually, nothing. I mean, there's so much gets shuffled up in the end. Okay, I'm trying to scroll up and see if we missed anyone's question, please feel free to rewrite it again in the chat box. Because they're so easy to miss. There are a lot. Okay.
I'd just like to say that I think it's really what you said about finding your own method is really important, because there are a lot of writers who do say, oh no, it has to be this way. It's just not true. It is finding what works for you. And
Thank you.
that's the most important part.
Yeah. I've interviewed too many writers to think that there's one way of doing anything. It's whatever works for you. And if it works for you, then who cares what anyone else thinks? I don't care if you write at 3 a.m. by the light of the moon. You know, there's like superstition. It's actually, I have a little piece on that in the book. Being superstitious can get in your way if it puts too many constraints on your writing time. But then there's what Joe Haldeman, the science fiction writer, said, which is, I'm no more superstitious than the next writer, which means if I lost my lucky coffee mug, I'd be out of a job. 20 years after he wrote that, he was on a panel with me, and I asked him if he still had his lucky coffee mug, and he held it up. It's like, okay, protect that mug. And,
I mean, if it works for him, then it works for him. So
yep.
And I like the idea of, the bath as being the place where most of your great ideas come. And, I think it's a good idea to leave a marker in the bathroom, like just in case, during the shower. What is that, like the delta state? They say that, when people are in a shower, they're in a state that is similar to sleep, to delta sleep. Is that true?
I think it is, because if you're doing kind of on
Okay.
automatic, your brain might
Yeah.
have some extra processing time. I know one
Okay.
writer who thought he got his best ideas in the middle of the night, so he set his alarm to
Uh-huh.
go off every 20 minutes in the middle of the night, which to me would drive me insane, but he kept a pad by the bed, Oh yeah. Sarah notes that
Well, I
you
do
can't tell
something.
you
I
how
do
often I've run.
something similar. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Sarah says, can't tell you how often I've run dripping from the shower. Whatever works. I know some people have actually got little, like waterproof markers. Yeah, okay. I said, if it works for you, do it. Men have to get,
And
who shave, have time to kind of think looking at that, they can keep a pad next to them.
okay. And a good idea that also works for me is, I keep my phone next to me when I go to sleep. And some of the best images, they just appear right before I snooze off completely. So I do, sometimes just not really wake myself up because I'm not really asleep. But, once you get that idea, when you're snoozing, you kind of write down what you saw, or that happens with poetry. I mean, it's not something that you would do for an essay or for maybe, I don't know. I haven't written a novel yet. Still in the process, but it certainly works for poetry. Yet.
Yeah, that's another
It's
trick, by the
still
way. Some
cooking
people
up.
talk about, I've seen people talk about being unpublished writer. No, you're a pre-published writer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
I
good
like that.
distinction. Yeah. I said that, Glenda, you're on mute now.
Point in my life, I was a poetry publisher, and I found that
Yeah.
a lot of writers have very unrealistic expectations about what publication will do for them. They think they'll immediately become famous. They think that their book will be on demand in every bookshop. It isn't, believe me. And they really are quite unrealistic, and sometimes they're resentful because they feel the publisher hasn't done enough for them, when they really just have very high expectations. I mean, occasionally that happens, but even J.K. Rowling submitted her book to so many people who rejected it. So did Lord of the Rings writer as well. But I was just going to say this. I want to mention this book. This is a collection of the notes of Agatha Christie compiled by an Irish writer, John Curran, and it's from her secret notebooks. It's every time she wrote down an idea, or some of them turned into books, some of them didn't. But it has in chronological order her notebooks from her grandson, Matthew Pritchard. And it's quite an amazing book because it gives you an insight into how she wrote, which might give you some hints as to how you might or might not want to write yourself. But
someone's asking the name of the book, Glenda. What's the name of the book?
Sorry. It's can you see it there? It's Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks.
Complete Secret Notebooks. Okay.
And it's a very thick book. And some of the stories she didn't actually finish. and other ones change dramatically. And some of her work she has no notes for at all that we could find. So
Whatever. Yeah, I mean, she got inspired off You'll notice there's certain patterns in his work too. Like, for example, if there's a dashing RAF, officer, he's almost invariably a bad guy because her first husband was a dashing RAF officer who betrayed her. So, you get your inspiration where you can.
mm.
You can always kill them off. It's the advantage of writing murder mysteries.
Yeah, I mean, it's gratifying in a sense for many who write them and many who read them as well.
In a sense, that means you're using your work as a way of creating an alternative reality to the one you've experienced.
Exactly.
Is
And
that
many do.
truthful?
Yeah, it's I mean, people talk about the Mary Sue, or the Gary Stu, the stand-in character for you, and it's like, and so is it good? I don't care. Or alternate realities where certain things happen. There's actually, interestingly, in comic strips, the comic strip that, for better or for worse, which ran for many years, was based on the creator's family, but she wound up evolving it to this sort of alternate reality of what her family might have been, which was actually kind of a little weird when she talked about it, because it was like she thought her son should do one thing and he didn't, so she wrote the character to do it instead. Okay, I mean, it worked for the story. Yeah.
Okay, right. Would anyone else like to ask Dr. Kellner a question? I guess we still have time for one more. So, yes, Paula.
Would you talk a little bit about your own fiction?
Oh, sure. Well, I have 4 non-published novels, 3 science fiction, 1 urban fantasy, and I'm fine with that, because I can always, I mean, I feel like I'm a writer. I'll write another one that will sell, or I'll save it, which has happened with many people, by the way. My published fiction, that both happen to be mysteries. The most recent was set in 10th century Iceland. It's a Viking era mystery, and I already have a sequel that I'm working on that may turn into a novel with I've got like 25,000 words so far, and going to need more. So I don't have a lot of time to do that, to be honest. So I save it. I save it up and try to, write it when I want. I've got a couple of nonfiction books. I've got proposals. I've got like 4 proposals in play, and I'm going to have to do a 5th. But those are different for me. So yeah, I write mysteries and science fiction, and some of it gets published. So hopefully more as I get better.
So as you said, it's not a race. Sometimes
a
it
race.
could take years and years and years to, for the right moment to come. Yeah.
Or, I kept tinkering with the story. The first draft was terrible, and over time I got better and better, and it became a different story. Same characters, roughly, same setting, better story.
Yeah.
I see someone's got a hand up. The
Nahum.
virtual hand.
Nahum.
Hello. This was a great
Hi.
session. I have a question. How do you make sure that you don't lose motivation if you're showing your work to other people and they don't necessarily like it?
Yes, because it's a two-edged sword, because there's it's a way to build your motivation, but it's also a way to suppress it. The first issue is you have to decide who to show it to. If there are also people who will say things like, "It's good," and so I would say part of it is you might need to, if they have very specific, practical recommendations and advice, you can use that in 2 ways. One is you can take the advice, or you can say, "I don't agree with any of that, and I'm going to prove it." So you turn it around and say, "I'm going to prove they're wrong." So you have to have some commitment to your own work, and that's what the value piece is, right? That you have to consider your own work important enough. Good editors know, and I've had this relationship with my wife for many years as well, that editing comments people make are not obligatory. It's always the writer's choice. And I sometimes find that getting feedback from someone actually triggers my desire to do it differently, or it triggers a thought saying, no, I don't like that idea, but I have a better one. So, it helps to have I mean, Sarah can talk all day long about workshops. So can I, actually, but workshops work for some people. They don't for others. I don't use a workshop. Or you have a select group of people that you like. So Toni has one alpha reader, me, and 2 beta readers that she trusts. And those are the only people she shows it to before she's ready to send it off to her agent. So I'd say the guideline is find the right person, or use the feedback in the way that suits you, because you're the writer here. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. Thank you so much.
And one person said, you have to believe in your motivation. Yeah, you have to believe in your writing. That doesn't mean, it's always going to be perfect. It just means you can solve the problem if there is one. So, yeah, Dune got rejected 40 times and was eventually published by a publisher who up until then had published manuals for cars. Jonathan Livingston Seagull was, I think, rejected 43 times by every publisher in New York. And I knew one New York editor who said, I rejected it and I'd reject it again. So sometimes it works, even despite everyone rejecting you.
I mean, Jasper Ford, when we
yeah.
hosted him in June, he got rejected 76 times before he became an international bestseller.
And his books are nuts, but they are so good. You just had to find the person to appreciate it.
Right.
I have to tell one story. Toni's first novel got rejected by a lot of people. And the funny part was she got 2 rejections for the same novel, one of which said, the characters are very wooden, and the other one said the characters are great. So, it's hard to get objective measurement, even from professionals. So
yeah, and I guess the more you're rejected, the closer you are to being accepted.
It's a very good way to think about it. Actually, that's what salespeople do. They say, if it takes me an average of 100 pitches to get 1 sale, then if I'm on, great, I'm at number 49, number 50, number 51, reject, because I'm getting me that much closer to the objective.
Yeah.
But sometimes you may decide, I'm going to just set it aside and work on something else. And that's okay too. Perry, Anne Perry wrote 10 different mystery novels set in different eras, all of which got rejected. She set one that got published in Victorian. And sorry, Victorian. My wife corrects me. So that one sold. So she wrote Victorian from then on, until she got successful enough to try to maybe resell some of the old ones.
Well, we love your novels, Leigh Perry. They're just amazing. Especially Sid.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
On her
So
behalf.
thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelner, and for this wonderful, wonderful session, which I'm sure, everybody found beneficial and enlightening and inspiring. So thank you again. And we hope to
welcome.
see you also in future sessions and events with Indelible Evenings.
Would love to.
I also want to thank the audience, and we're sorry if we weren't able to read all the comments, but I'm sure they were all great comments. I saw so many thank yous, so many wonderfuls, so many, nice adjectives in the chat box. Okay. Raymond Harrison says there's J.D. Salinger who, oh, wait a minute. It's gone up. But yes.
Salinger wrote many books,
you do
but decided
mention
not
him
to
in the book
publish
as
them.
well.
Yeah. And we've got a question, will this be available online?
Yes, so the session is recorded and it will be uploaded within the next couple of days. You'll find it on the YouTube channel, Indelible Evenings. So yeah, just like all the other sessions. Okay, so
Okay.
thank you so much. Dr. Kellner,
Thank
have
you.
a wonderful day. Everybody else who's
You
on
have a
this
wonderful
side of the
evening.
planet, have a
Okay.
wonderful evening.
Thank you.
So
I look forward to seeing all your books. So
we hope
take
so.
care.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.